The air in the royal bedchamber is thick with the smell of wood smoke and cold sweat. It is the dead of night, February 1399. Pontefract Castle, a formidable stone fortress in the heart of England, sleeps uneasily. A single candle flickers, its dancing light catching the terror in the young king's eyes. He is Richard II, by the grace of God, King of England and Lord of Ireland. But tonight, the titles are meaningless. The heavy velvet hangings of his bed offer no comfort, only shadows. The rough hands of 4 armed men drag him from his sheets. Their faces are grim, set, anonymous in the gloom. He does not fight. He is a man already defeated, his regal composure shattered into a raw, human fear. The cold stone of the floor bites into his bare feet. The coarse fabric of a commoner's cloak is thrown over his thin nightshirt. He is shoved, stumbling, into the dark, winding corridors. The only sounds are the ragged draw of his own breath, the jangle of his captor's mail, and the distant, mournful cry of a watchman calling the hour. A kingdom is being stolen, one silent, terrified footstep at a time. This is not a random act of violence. It is the culmination of a poison that has been festering for years, a story of ambition, betrayal, and a king who believed his power was absolute, ordained by God himself. To understand the kidnapping of a king, we must first understand the man. Richard of Bordeaux ascended the throne as a boy of 10, his golden hair and delicate features belying a core of steel. He inherited a realm still trembling from the Black Death and locked in a draining, endless war with France. His court was a spectacle of opulence. Tapestries woven with gold thread. The scent of spiced wine and perfumed nobles. The sound of minstrels singing of chivalry. Richard cultivated an aura of divine majesty. He dined alone, elevated on a dais, while his greatest lords sat below. He insisted on being addressed as Your Highness and Your Majesty, terms that grated on the ears of the old barons, men who preferred the blunt, familiar my lord. And among those barons, one man watched the young kingess growing absolutism with a cold and calculating eye, his own cousin, Henry of Bolingbroke. Henry was everything Richard was not. Where Richard was elegant and artistic, Henry was rugged and martial. A champion of the joust, a proven commander, a man whose authority came not from ceremony, but from the respect he commanded on the battlefield. The tension between them was a slow-burning fuse, a family feud played out on the stage of a nation. The first spark came in 1387. A group of powerful nobles known as the Lords Appellant challenged Richard's rule, accusing his favourites of corruption and mismanagement. Henry, young and ambitious, joined them. The Appellants triumphed at the Battle of Radcot Bridge, and for a time, the king was a puppet in their hands. Richard was forced to watch as his closest friends were executed without trial. The memory of that humiliation, the sight of his men's heads mounted on London Bridge, would fester in his soul for a decade. He bided his time, playing the gracious ruler, but the desire for vengeance was a canker in his heart. By 1397, Richard felt strong enough to strike. He moved with the swiftness and ruthlessness of a serpent. The old Lords Appellant were arrested on charges of treason. The smell of fear returned to the halls of power. One was executed. Another was murdered, his body left to rot in the streets. Richard had his revenge, but he made one crucial, fatal mistake in his purge. He spared Henry of Bolingbroke. Instead of execution, he sentenced Henry to exile for 10 years. It was an act of calculated mercy, or perhaps arrogant oversight. Richard, confident in his restored power, believed he had neutered his rival. The following year, 1398, the stench of betrayal grew thicker. John of Gaunt, Henry's father and the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king, died. Gaunt was a pillar of the state, and his vast Lancastrian estates represented a fortune that could rival the crown's. With Henry abroad, Richard saw an opportunity. In an act of breathtaking political folly, he extended Henry's exile to life. Then, he did the unthinkable. He confiscated the entire Lancastrian inheritance. He stole Henry's birthright. In the taverns and market squares of England, a low murmur of discontent began to grow. The king had broken the sacred contract between lord and vassal. If he could do this to his own cousin, the son of John of Gaunt, what protection did any man have? The air grew heavy with a sense of impending storm. Across the English Channel, in the court of France, Henry of Bolingbroke received the news. The betrayal was complete. The king had not only banished him but had robbed him of his very name and legacy. The decision was made. It was no longer about reclaiming an inheritance. It was about seizing a crown. In June of 1399, while Richard was distracted on a military campaign in Ireland, Henry landed on the coast of Yorkshire. He came not with an invading army, but with a small band of retainers, claiming only his rightful title as Duke of Lancaster. It was a brilliant, cynical gambit. He was not a rebel, but a wronged nobleman seeking justice. And the country, weary of Richard's heavy taxes and autocratic rule, flocked to his banner. Castles surrendered without a fight. Towns opened their gates. The kingdom, it seemed, was giving up its king without a struggle. When Richard returned from Ireland in July, he found his support had evaporated like morning mist. He fled to the coast, perhaps hoping to escape to France, but was cornered in Conwy Castle in Wales. The trap was closing. He agreed to negotiate, to meet with Henry's emissary, the Earl of Northumberland. Northumberland offered terms: surrender, and your life will be spared. Richard, isolated and desperate, agreed. It was a promise made in bad faith. He was not surrendering to a peace treaty. He was walking into a cage. He was taken to the Tower of London, the traditional prison for traitors. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The king was now a prisoner in his own fortress. The halls that had once echoed with his commands now echoed with the heavy tread of his captors' guards. The scent of his perfumes was replaced by the damp, fungal smell of the Thames and the cold stone of his cell. His world had shrunk to a single, locked door. In a draughty chamber in the tower, a document was placed before him. The Articles of Deposition. 33 charges listing his tyranny, his broken promises, his unfit rule. He was forced to listen as his own reign was dismantled, line by damning line. Then he was told to sign, to abdicate, to renounce the divine right he had spent a lifetime cultivating. His hand, which had once sealed the fate of so many, now trembled as it put quill to parchment. With a few strokes, King Richard II was no more. He was simply Richard of Bordeaux, a prisoner. The crown, heavy with jewels and history, was passed to his cousin. Henry of Bolingbroke became King Henry IV. But a living, breathing ex-king is a dangerous thing. He is a symbol, a rallying point, a ghost that can haunt a new regime. Richard could not be allowed to live. The final, grim journey north to Pontefract Castle was not just a relocation. It was a death sentence in motion. The castle's dungeons were deep, its walls thick. It was a place where men were sent to be forgotten. And on that cold night in February, when the 4 men entered his chamber, Richard knew his time had come. The kidnapping was the final, brutal act in a coup that had been months in the making. The king was gone. Now, the man had to disappear, too. The heavy oak door to his cell groaned shut, its iron bolts slamming home with a finality that echoed through the very marrow of his bones. Richard was alone. The air in Pontefract's donjon was frigid and still, carrying the scent of damp stone, old straw, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. High above, a single narrow window, little more than a slit, allowed a sliver of pale moonlight to cut through the darkness. It was not enough to see by, only enough to illuminate the motes of dust dancing in the air like forgotten spirits. He was no longer a king. He was a problem. And in the ruthless calculus of power, problems are solved, not managed. His days fell into a grim, monotonous rhythm. The scrape of a tray pushed under the door, the bland taste of pottage and stale bread, the endless, crushing silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the castle he once commanded, the call of a guard, the clang of a smith's hammer, sounds of a life that went on without him. He was a ghost in his own kingdom. His hands, once accustomed to the weight of a scepter, now felt only the chill of the stone floor. His mind, once occupied with matters of state and patronage of the arts, now had nothing to feed upon but memories and regret. The opulent fragrances of his court, sandalwood, ambergris, beeswax, were replaced by the stink of his own unwashed body and the chamber pot in the corner. Meanwhile, in the bustling, smoke-filled halls of Westminster, Henry IV was learning the heavy price of a stolen crown. His reign began not with celebration, but with conspiracy. Whispers slithered through the court like serpents. The new king's face, once confident, was now etched with a permanent strain. He slept with a dagger under his pillow. Every smiling courtier was a potential assassin. Every murmur of loyalty, a possible lie. The crown felt less like a prize and more like a burning brand upon his brow. He had seized power through popular support and legal maneuvering, but he ruled by the sword. And a kingdom built on betrayal is inherently unstable. The first rebellion erupted at the Christmas feast in 1399. A group of loyalist earls, who had bowed to Henry out of necessity, plotted to storm Windsor Castle, murder the new king and his sons, and restore Richard to the throne. The plan was audacious, desperate. It failed. The conspirators were captured, subjected to the brutal spectacle of public execution. Their heads joined the grisly collection on London Bridge, a stark warning to any who would question the new order. But the message it sent to Henry was even clearer. As long as Richard lived, his throne would never be secure. The ghost in Pontefract Castle had to be exorcised. Back in the darkness of his cell, Richard's world shrank further. His guards, once respectful, now treated him with a coarse indifference. The quality of his food worsened. The silence grew more profound, a physical weight pressing down on him. He must have known. Every creak of a footstep on the stair outside, every jangle of keys, sent a fresh jolt of terror through him. Was this the moment? Was it day or night? Time lost all meaning. He was trapped in an endless, waking nightmare, waiting for the blow that he knew must fall. The order was given. It was not written down. It was a quiet word, a nod, an understanding passed from the highest levels of power to the men who did the dirty, necessary work of state. The method was left deliberately vague, a shadow that would allow for plausible deniability, a quiet suffocation, a convenient illness, a fall on the stairs. The details mattered less than the result. The night it happened, the air in Yorkshire was bitingly cold. A hard frost settled on the battlements of Pontefract, glittering in the torchlight. Inside the donjon, the cold was a living thing, seeping through the stones. Richard, huddled in his thin blankets, likely heard the approach of more than one set of footsteps. This was different from the usual changing of the guard. The steps were heavier, purposeful. The key turned in the lock with a slow, grinding screech. The door swung open, framing 4 dark figures against the faint torchlight from the corridor. They did not speak. Their breathing was loud in the suffocating silence. They moved with a grim efficiency, their intentions clear in their posture. Richard would have scrambled back, a cry caught in his throat. Perhaps he pleaded. Perhaps he cursed his cousin's name. Perhaps he met his end with the dignity of the Plantagenet line he represented. History does not record his final words. It only records the outcome. The official story, released by Henry's government, was that Richard had refused food and starved himself to death in a state of despair. A convenient, passive end. It painted a picture of a broken man, willingly leaving the world, absolving the new regime of direct blame. But the truth, whispered in taverns and chronicled in manuscripts that had to be hidden, was far more brutal. He had been murdered. The most persistent account, recorded by the French chronicler Jean Cretin, claims he was struck on the head with an axe. Others speak of suffocation, of a group of men holding him down, pressing a pillow over his face until his struggles ceased. The exact method is lost to the shadows, but the fact of the act is not. His body was not immediately released. It was a piece of evidence that had to be managed. It was displayed, weeks later, at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The face was said to be visible, to prove to a skeptical populace that he was truly gone. But the condition of the body, and the long delay, only fueled the rumors of a violent end. The king was dead. The problem was solved. But the stain of his blood would forever mark the House of Lancaster. The fallout was immediate and long-lasting. Henry IV's reign was plagued by perpetual unrest, rebellions in Wales, war with Scotland, and constant noble discontent. He was a king who could never truly rest, haunted by the manner of his ascent. The very act that gave him the crown had poisoned his rule. The divine right of kings, a concept Richard had championed, was shattered. If a king could be deposed and murdered by his own cousin, then what was the foundation of power? It was no longer God's will, but the will of the strongest baron. This single act planted the seeds for a century of dynastic conflict, a bloody civil war that would later tear England apart, the Wars of the Roses. And then, there are the mysteries. The whispers that did not die with Richard's body. 4 years after his reported death, rumours persisted that he had escaped, that a double had died in his place in Pontefract, and that the true Richard was wandering Europe, waiting for the right moment to return and reclaim his throne. A mysterious figure claiming to be Richard even appeared in Scotland, causing Henry IV no end of diplomatic headaches. These stories were likely fantasy, the desperate hopes of a defeated faction, but they speak to the unsettling, incomplete nature of his end. A king murdered in secret gives birth to 1,000 ghosts. The corpse was a political tool. It was transported from Pontefract to London, a slow, sombre procession through a countryside gripped by winter and unease. The body, according to some accounts, was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Thousands filed past, their breaths misting in the cold air of the great church. They saw a face, waxy and still, dressed in royal robes. But the face was said to be heavily made up, the features partially obscured. The government insisted it was proof. The king was dead. Let the mourning, and the acceptance, begin. But the display had the opposite effect. The whispers grew louder, not quieter. The delay between his reported death and the public showing was too long. The condition of the body was too perfect, too staged. In the taverns and market squares, the story began to shift. He hadn't starved. He hadn't been struck down in a fight. He had been executed, coldly and deliberately, on the orders of the man who now wore his crown. The new regime's carefully crafted narrative of a self-inflicted death was crumbling under the weight of public suspicion. A king could be deposed by Parliament, but only God could judge a king. Henry had overstepped, and everyone knew it. Henry IV's throne, carved from this single act of regicide, was a seat of perpetual thorns. His reign, which lasted until 1413, was one of the most troubled in English history. He was like a man who had stolen a great, snarling beast, only to find he could never tame it. Rebellions erupted like a fever rash across the land. The Welsh, under the charismatic Owain Glyndwr, saw the weakness and rose up, burning English settlements and reclaiming their hills. The Percys of Northumberland, the very family who had helped Henry to the throne, turned against him, furious over broken promises and a lack of reward. The Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403 was a bloody, brutal affair where Henry himself was nearly killed, an arrow striking him in the face. The smell of the battlefield, blood, mud, and fear was a constant companion. His victory was Pyrrhic. The kingdom was bleeding, and the hemorrhage seemed unstoppable. Worse than the rebellions was the sickness that gripped the king himself. A terrible skin disease, perhaps leprosy or a severe psoriatic condition, began to consume him. To his contemporaries, it was the mark of God's judgment, the divine wrath for the sin of regicide. The once vigorous warrior became a reclusive, pain-racked figure. The scent of his illness, a foul, medicinal odor of rot and poultices, followed him through the palace. His final years were a living hell, a constant, physical reminder of the price of ambition. He had gained a kingdom and lost his peace, his health, and, in the eyes of many, his soul. The long-term consequences fractured England for generations. The concept of the divine right of kings, so carefully cultivated by Richard, lay in tatters. The precedent was set. A monarch could be removed by force. This was no longer a theoretical debate. It was a bloody fact. The throne was no longer a sacred altar, but a prize to be won. This single act of betrayal festered in the national psyche, a poison that would erupt 2 generations later into the dynastic carnage of the Wars of the Roses. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster would clash in a conflict born in the dark dungeons of Pontefract. The ghosts of Richard II and Henry IV would look upon the fields of Towton and Bosworth and see the bitter fruit of their struggle. And then, there are the ghosts that would not rest. 4 years, even decades after 1400, a persistent rumour haunted Europe. Richard was not dead. He had escaped. A clever double had taken his place in Pontefract, suffering the fate intended for the king. The real Richard, the story went, had slipped away in the guise of a monk or a merchant, fleeing to Scotland, or to the remote islands of the Hebrides, or even to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. These were not just the fantasies of madmen. They were credible enough to be used as weapons. A man claiming to be Richard appeared in Scotland, causing Henry IV immense political trouble. He was, of course, an impostor, but the fact that he could garner support showed how deeply the official story was disbelieved. The mystery was a weapon, and it kept Henry looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. The debate among historians echoes these ancient whispers. The physical evidence is lost. Richard's body was eventually interred at Westminster Abbey, but his tomb offers no clues. The question remains, how did he die? The official record says starvation. The popular chronicles of the time, written by men sympathetic to Richard or hostile to Henry, speak of violence. Some modern historians lean towards the theory of a staged, public death to quell rebellion, suggesting he may have died earlier or later than reported. The truth is buried under layers of propaganda, fear, and 6 centuries of time. We are left with probabilities, not certainties. The most likely scenario is also the most brutal, that he was murdered on the orders, or at least with the tacit approval, of Henry IV to secure a fragile throne. It was a crime of state, cold, calculated, and utterly necessary from the perpetrator's point of view. The story ends not with a bang, but with a lingering, unsettling silence. The castle at Pontefract is now a ruin, its stones plundered for other buildings. The wind whistles through the empty spaces where once a king trembled in the dark. You can stand there today, on the grass that grows over the foundations of the Great Hall and the donjon, and feel the emptiness. There is no plaque that marks the exact spot of the murder. Perhaps it is better that way. For the true monument to Richard II is not made of stone. It is the enduring, chilling lesson of his fall. It is the knowledge that no power is absolute, no crown sits so securely that it cannot be taken, and that the darkest ambitions are often found not in the hearts of strangers but in the souls of those we call family.